For a very brief period of time, I thought it was a reference to Scrooge McDuck. As I grew older, my impression shifted to the less anthropomorphic Dickens eponym. Some years later, I pestered my favorite pastor with yet one more theological question, this time less hypothetical and more literal than who he thought would have been the first person to sin if it wasn't Adam or Eve or Cain. And he told me the answer to my question. And for a long time after that, I went with that answer to my question, which was, who or what is an Ebenezer? And he told me he thought it was a mountain. And this was a little bit before the days of Google, where I could fact check him. You heard the reference in the scripture reading this morning, a passing one anyway. But my question back then, I wasn't even pulling from 1 Samuel 7. I was wondering what in the world the reference was in Come Thou Fount. That second verse, maybe it's a third in some versions. Here I raise mine Ebenezer, hither by thy help I come. And I hope by thy good pleasure safely to arrive at home. Jesus sought me when a stranger wandering from the fold of God. He, to rescue me from danger, interposed his precious blood. Somehow I knew what interposing meant with relation to Jesus' blood, but I could not figure out what mine Ebenezer was. It was an obscure reference, to be sure. Ebenezer in the Hebrew, though, literally, it means God has helped us. Indeed, it even explains that in 1 Samuel 7. God has helped us, or a version of that. The word Ebenezer is a reminder of God's faithful provision. In that moment of adversity and previous calamity, now Samuel is raising up neither an ancient mountain, as my favorite pastor thought, nor ghosts of an aged miser, as Charles Dickens might say, but instead a stone that serves as an altar of remembrance. It's a marker of God's presence with them. In other times of war throughout the Hebrew Scriptures or around other moments of significance, we see altars being erected. They aren't always called Ebenezers. Maybe they were as simple as a cairn. Or maybe they were sturdier, intended to remain in place as perpetual memorials. Maybe other times they were more like altars for offering a sacrifice. Regardless of the look and the full functionality of these altars, we see similar rituals throughout the ages. Some of these are as simple as a worship service. Others, it might be laying a cornerstone, that memory box set in stone that memorializes the moment of construction, usually with a dedication service where, at least as it was in our own church on multiple occasions, we also worship the God who had persisted in helping us through our trials and our triumphs to that point in time. In previous sermons and in other forums and writings, I've mentioned before how we as a church rallied together when our buildings burned down, and how after each catastrophe we rebuilt a new building for community and worship. I don't know if I've mentioned this other piece, though, but on two separate occasions. Upon the building of a new church sanctuary, our church, First Baptist, came together from what could have been possible estrangement or at least divergent visions of the future. What do I mean by that? Well, one time in the 1830s, there was a group from First Baptist who was preparing to leave to start a Second Baptist church in Worcester. We don't know all the specifics as to why there was to be a new church, but regardless, that first fire to our building brought everyone back together for another decade and a half. Similarly, when the Ionic Avenue Sanctuary was being constructed, when we, as First Baptists, were at that time on Worcester Common, the First Baptist Church, we invited the Main Street Baptist Church to reunite with First Baptist because Main Street had been founded by First Baptist to become the Third Baptist Church in Worcester. And in that moment of building a new sanctuary on Ionic Avenue, the two congregations came together again and became one in a spirit of rebuilding and repairing. Whatever differences they had, they overcame. Whatever divergent visions of the future they held, they adapted them. And they set in stone, literally in the cornerstone, evidence of their cooperation and collective aspirations to better the heart of the Commonwealth by the actions as a church rooted in the heart of Worcester. In spite of all of their plans and aspirations and good intentions with such a big new sanctuary, they still made a point to mark the moment of God's past help and ongoing presence along the way. Whether catastrophe or celebration, the people of First Baptist have often found ways to mark God's presence and provision within their community of faith. It isn't always a cornerstone. It wasn't always building something that had been burnt down and making it a new building. Sometimes these Ebenezers were church hymns, written to mark significant moments, like the one I want to read for you that was written on the occasion of our 50th anniversary in 1862. Written against the backdrop of war, both in 1812 and 1862. Hear L.H. Sigourney's poignant words. Rich memories of the godly men, evangelist and guide they bring, who for the gospel stood here at his altar's side, while some in other hallowed fields pursue their purpose blessed, and some, their faithful labor done, have entered into rest. Rich memories are recalled at the sight of the altar. And whether they had an altar or called it that back then isn't really something I looked into before now, but the reminder is a happy accident, even if unintentional, as altars are so closely tied to remembering. Indeed, the occasion of communion, which is often served from the altar or the table, is a memorial meal, one of remembrance. Within the hymn, the work doesn't end with simply remembering, though, the composer in recognizing the work of those in other hallowed fields. Perhaps a play on the word field itself, those in other professions or in battle, either one are laid to rest. The composer elevates each to a sacred calling, vocation, or in the composer's words, they all pursue their purpose blessed. It is a hymn celebrating the past 50 years that's also calling on the people of the present to pursue their own purpose blessed. That's kind of the point of any memorial, isn't it? How often do we erect a monument or statue only to forget what it stood for? How often do we create holidays or commemorations only to leave it all in the past? Why else do we name scholarships and buildings and bridges and streets after people? Sure, maybe some of these have been corrupted and are now mere efforts to stroke egos and vanity. But aren't they rooted in something inherent to our being in the world? Aren't these memorials and monuments and named endowments getting at what we ultimately crave? I mean, isn't that what so much of memory is all about? That we want to remember or to be remembered so that we can know that we mattered at all. Isn't that why an endowment carries so much emotion for many of us? Because if it's used, or if you want some negative language, if it's depleted, doesn't that signify failure on some level for many of us? But worse, if it's gone or if it fails, what is left to show of us, of our work, of what really mattered here? If it's all gone, and the church, in our mind, closes down one day. For some of us, endowments can be idols, a corruption, as it were. But for most of us, dare I say almost all of us, whether now or some time in the past, it originated as our own Ebenezer, our own way of saying God blessed our purposes, and it mattered, and we wanted to keep mattering. Us, ourselves, to keep mattering. What happened here to continue mattering and blessing the purposes of God's church. For people of faith, these altars, these remembrances, these Ebenezers, whatever they look like, are our ways of remembering God's provision and help, our tangible reminder amid our existential angst from our past selves to our present selves and to our future selves that unequivocally, yes, we matter to God and to each other. And we learn that in community together. We don't simply remember, we remember. We aren't just being reminded of the past when we observe these kind of remembrances and memorials and altars to God's help. When we truly engage the purpose blessed of an Ebenezer, we mark God's provision past and are moved to faithful actions in the present and hopefully the future. To say it one final way, we are emboldened by the past to embody in the present what we envision for the future. In times of adversity or calamity, in moments of hope and celebration, our church over the years has joined together in community, overcoming obstacles and disagreements. Can you imagine how many of those we've had in 200 plus years? We do it all in order to raise Ebenezers, to mark the provision and faithfulness of God, and to make meaning of God's presence with us by reaffirming God's presence within us. And each time it inspires us to actions brave and bold and impactful. They're reminders to us to keep going. That's what Samuel was doing when he erected this Ebenezer to begin with. It was a marker of God's past help, but it wasn't meant to stay there or for the people to stay there, but to take it with them. That notion that God's help is ever present. For just a few more moments, I beg your attention. This morning, if you can believe it, it marks 2 years since the beginning of the pandemic here in Worcester. 2 years ago this Sunday, today, we sent you out on a Lenten journey of dislocation and deep intention. Unbeknownst to us at the time was that 2 years later we'd still be in a state of disequilibrium. Throughout these past 2 years, we have tried our best to cultivate connection and continuity, to create new traditions of our same values, and to care for our neighbors as much, or in some cases even more, than our own health and safety and certainly comfort. These past 2 years have meant catastrophe for so many lives and livelihoods, businesses and congregations, and our church hasn't gone unscathed. We've seen illnesses and we've experienced deaths. We've watched members relocate or step back. But through it all, overall, neither as solely a business or a nonprofit, but as a church family, we have come together and we have held together. Even while apart, we have held together, uniting in worship, no matter time or space. We have given generously and loved widely and served when it was possible. You have always been a church who has valued each person and who's gone the extra step to mark it. That might have looked like ordaining women as deacons or in ministry, or affirming before it was even legal to have gay marriage that we would recognize and bless same-sex unions, or today trying our best to make known that we believe that if all lives supposedly matter, then black lives must matter too. Throughout our history, we've had strong hospitality teams and outreach committees and deacons who keep track of as many members as we can. We've tried our best to be a church who values each and every person and who goes the extra step to mark that. So today, we are raising up our own Ebenezer. It's not of marble or granite, but a melody of gratitude, a marker of grace, a memorial to God's unending presence with us. It's our hymn that says that we mattered here, that we will matter again, that we will always matter to God and to each other. So in this moment of commemoration, we'll join in singing and celebrating this version of an Ebenezer. And in a few weeks, we'll invite you to a forum yet to be decided, when we will invite you to also write stanzas to this hymn. And as you know, it's set to the hymn tune Nettleton, familiar to many of you, and as Wesley shared, as the tune of Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing. Friends, let us mark this moment together when we affirmed God's presence with us throughout the past 2 years and even now, and we resolve to rebuild together the work of God through our ministries as the First Baptist Church of Worcester, to profess the past 2 years during the pandemic and to proclaim for future generations, we mattered here. What we did mattered here. We matter now, and we will matter always to the God who is our deep hope and consolation. May it be, O God, receive our Ebenezer this day. Amen. Well, friends, I invite you to stand and join in singing this hymn, Our Deep Hope and Consolation. It is on the back, as Wesley shared.